what you're seeing is, on one hand, in the West, demand destruction because prices have gotten so high. And in fact, not just in the West, globally. But you're also seeing supply destruction. So either threats of or overt action in favor of saying we're going to reduce the amount we sell, or we're going to restrict what other people can sell, or we're going to make it very difficult to get hold of commodity X, Y, or Z. It's not happening everywhere. It's not happening all the time. But that risk is now hanging in the background. And it means that while you could see commodity prices start to come down again, and we are in some areas, absolutely, that threat is always ever present. And it makes you much more nervous that you could get another spike back up again at some point.
Of course, big energy and commodity producers have benefited. Australia has been one of those countries. How do you think things look over the horizon for a country like ours?
Well, in many respects, Australia does do well because, obviously, as you said, you're a producer of many of the commodities whose price has generally gone up, even though they are more volatile recently too. But the corollary to what we're seeing is, as part of the Ukraine war, although it isn't the only driver by any means, and it's simplistic to say it's just because of Ukraine, is very high inflation. And so it's not as if you only get the high commodity prices, but the price of everything else stays low. There's a price to be paid, quite literally, for everything around you. And of course, that means higher interest rates, that means pain for mortgage holders, all kinds of complications are coming along with this. So there are clouds to that silver lining, if you will.
And of course, those, I guess, price surges that we have seen started before this conflict, when we had the pandemic, with prices coming through from then. Of course, as you pointed out, that's led to inflation. Central banks have tried to rein that in with the rate hikes we've seen globally. You've commented that it would take a recession to bring inflation under control. Is that still your view?
Well, I'm not saying it's my view. That's a view of an emerging consensus amongst central banks themselves. They are still saying that inflation will come down. For example, the Reserve Bank is saying, yes, it will come down, but it's not going to get anywhere close to the 2% target until 2025 without the recession. And you're now starting to get more and more voices saying, well, if we needed to come down more quickly than that, then yeah, it probably is going to be a recession. As I said, that's not a forecast. It's just something that sadly tends to go alongside sharp falls in inflation. It doesn't tend to go down and stay down without economic pain.
And is Australia in danger of, I guess, catching that recession wave?
I don't see how Australia is a special case that isn't. Let's put it like that. I'm not making a specific call on Australia here or in general. But if you look at the factors that you see in every developed economy, rising interest rates, high household debt, that high inflation, which is already crimping purchasing power, offset by very low unemployment for now, how does that result? Can you find this Goldilocks path where unemployment goes up a little bit, wage growth comes down a little bit, inflation comes down a lot, housing doesn't tumble, and everyone's happy and everything goes back to normal? Can it be done? Yes. Is it the most likely outcome both in Australia and everywhere else? No.
You've pointed out markets are always looking for glimmers of hope. One scenario compares this to the Korean War, as in neither side will win, it could go on for years. What would that mean for global markets?
Well, let's take that as a scenario. Let's say it goes on for years, it grinds on, it escalates so that more and more equipment has to be thrown into it. That is going to generate a lot more inflation. First of all, this war up until now has been fought largely with inventories, or the rundown of inventories of US military equipment. If it's going to grind on, we'll need to produce a lot more with military equipment. Europe will have to do it, Australia will have to do it, everyone will have to do it. And that's at a time of low unemployment, quite tight capacity in a lot of industries. And as I said earlier on, this supply chain pressure in terms of commodity prices. So let's throw that in and we'll see how inflationary it is. But at the same time, the broad corollary to what we're seeing is more and more people saying we're vulnerable in terms of broader geopolitical pressures on supply chains. We need to have more jobs at home. We need to have supply chains that are shorter and nearer to us. Well, guess what? That's a great idea, but it's inflationary. It's going to be more expensive than having everything centered on China the way it has been up until now. So on two fronts, it adds to the impetus for higher inflation.
Michael, we've seen furious diplomatic repositioning going on. The US President Joe Biden has been visiting Europe. This has been described as a US-led world order against the autocratic East. What's the implication for the economic world order?
Well, first of all, I think that's a big oversimplification because that's how the West likes to portray it. But outside the West, that's not how it's seen at all. The vast majority of countries don't like what's happening in Ukraine, but aren't prepared to stand alongside the West and say we're going to pay much higher energy prices and much higher food prices, even though we're very poor, just because we're going to stand in sympathy with the West. So it's a much more grey than black and white story as it's being portrayed there. But how that plays out will determine what the future economic order looks like. The West gradually is starting to turn itself into more and more of a fortress, which is a trend I've been seeing coming for a long time. The East is increasingly doing the same, but a very large swathe of countries are still sitting there in the middle saying, well, we don't want to go with either side, but are you going to put a gun to our heads literally in some cases? We'll see how that plays out, but we need to play it very, very carefully. And I think the best advice I can give, if anyone wants to listen to any, is don't presume that the rest of the world sees things the way that you do. It's a very diverse planet with very diverse views. And, you have to win friends and influence people rather than just standing on a soapbox and speaking in lofty terms. People are worried about food, worried about energy, worried about security. And there are lots of different ways you can address that.
Michael, we're sitting here, it's the first anniversary of this war. There are predictions it could last 2 years, other predictions it could go on for 15. How do you see this ending?
Well, I can't make a specific call on how long it will go on. What I can say is I don't see any near-term possibility of it ending on terms that the West would like, i.e. a Ukrainian victory, unless we see a massive escalation in military production in Europe, which is not happening. Germany is walking away from all the commitments it made to rearm itself. So Europe is not putting its money where its mouth is. And America has multiple commitments, both in Asia and in Europe. So unless we see that change, that's unlikely to happen. But what I do think is also a concern is in the nearer term, whether we see any further escalation in terms of the Chinese peace plan, which is going to be proposed today. And on one level, fantastic, let's have a peace plan. Great, really, I applaud any efforts of that. But there are observers from the national security side worried that there might be an implicit threat from the Chinese side to escalate in order to de-escalate. In other words, saying, we may start helping Russia more than we have been, the same way that America is helping Ukraine, to try and dissuade everyone to take a step back. Now, there could be a clever strategy for de-escalation, but it could spiral out of control. Excuse me. I'm worried to spiral out of control, then things are going to look a lot more tense and a lot more dangerous than they do now.
Michael Every, it's been great talking to you and getting your insights. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.